When the clock strikes 12 midnight, the rules reset. The signal breaks free. A new voice goes live. A new sound detonates. Northstrong Unsanctioned, the podcast that doesn't ask permission, doesn't follow scripts, and doesn't bow to the algorithm. Hosted by Maverick Northstrong. Broadcasting from the edge of culture, where truth, rhythm, and rebellion collide. Streaming on YouTube via the Northstrong frequency. When the world resets, Northstrong goes unsanctioned.
Between the Beats with Celine Crow. Good evening, night travelers, insomniacs, overthinkers, philosophers, musicians, survivors, and everybody listening from the shadows between midnight and dawn. This is Between the Beats on Northstrong Unsanctioned, and I'm your host, Celine Crow. Tonight's conversation is not going to be comfortable. It is not going to fit neatly inside modern attention spans, and honestly, it probably should disturb you. Because tonight we're taking two things that seem completely unrelated and laying them side by side. One is a procedural handbook, the other is prophecy. One governs meetings, the other describes the collapse and judgment of kingdoms. One is called Robert's Rules of Order, the other is the revelation of St. John the Divine. And somewhere between those two texts lies a terrifying question. What happens when order itself becomes the mechanism through which corruption protects itself? What happens when procedure replaces truth? When bureaucracy outlives morality? When institutions become so obsessed with maintaining structure that they can no longer recognize justice? Tonight, we're not here to mock Robert's rules, and we are not here to blaspheme the Book of Revelations. We are here to examine power, because power always develops ritual, power always develops language, power always develops systems, and eventually, those systems stop serving people. People begin serving the systems. That is where tonight begins. Between the Beats with Celine Crow. Let's start with something deceptively simple. Meetings, committees, councils, boards, motions, voting, seconds, appeals, minutes. If you've ever sat through a church council, a homeowners association meeting, a city board hearing, or even a school assembly, chances are you've encountered Robert's Rules of Order. Originally designed by Henry Martin Robert in the 19th century, the system was meant to create fairness, order, structure, protection against chaos. And on paper, that sounds noble, because disorder can destroy communities. Without procedure, the loudest voice dominates. Without rules, meetings become riots. Without structure, emotion swallows reason. But history teaches us something uncomfortable. The systems created to protect fairness can also become shields for manipulation. A microphone can amplify truth or propaganda. A courtroom can defend innocence or legalize injustice. A parliament can protect liberty or manufacture tyranny. And Robert's rules contain a strange paradox. The better someone understands procedure, the easier it becomes to control outcomes while appearing completely legitimate. That sentence right there should make every listener stop for a moment, because evil rarely introduces itself as evil. It arrives organized, documented, approved, stamped, filed, seconded, passed unanimously. And now let's look at the Book of Revelations. Between the Beats with Celine Crow. When most people hear the word revelation, they imagine dragons, beasts, angels, disasters, blood-red moons, and apocalyptic fire. But beneath the symbolism, Revelation is fundamentally about systems, empires, governments, religious institutions, economic structures, political loyalty, public worship, control. The Book of Revelation is not merely predicting catastrophe. It is exposing the spiritual corruption hidden underneath organized civilization. And here's where things become unsettling. The beast in Revelation does not rise out of pure chaos. It rises out of structure. The beast governs buying and selling. The beast governs allegiance. The beast governs identity. The beast creates systems of participation, and those who refuse compliance become isolated. Not because the system lacks order, but because the system possesses too much centralized order. That distinction matters. The danger in revelation is not disorder. The danger is weaponized order. Order detached from truth, procedure detached from conscience, power detached from accountability. And suddenly, Robert's Rules begins to sound less like a harmless meeting guide and more like a metaphor for the machinery of institutional survival. Because every institution believes it is preserving stability, even corrupt institutions, especially corrupt institutions. History proves this repeatedly. Religious councils defended abuses. Governments legalized oppression. Corporate boards protected greed. Every single one of them had procedures. Every single one of them held votes. Every single one of them maintained order. And yet, they drifted further from justice. That is the warning hidden in the Book of Revelations. Not merely the end of the world, but the exposure of systems that mistake control for righteousness. Between the Beats, with Celine Crow. Let's talk about language. Every power structure develops vocabulary that outsiders struggle to penetrate. Legal systems have legal jargon. Finance has economic jargon. Academia has intellectual jargon. Religious institutions have theological jargon. And Robert's Rules has procedural jargon, point of order, motion to reconsider, table the motion, call the question, amendment. 2/3 vote, point of information. Now here's the psychological reality. The more complex the language becomes, the more ordinary people disengage. And once ordinary people disengage, power consolidates among specialists. That pattern repeats throughout history. In Revelation, symbolism itself becomes a coded language exposing hidden realities. Numbers, seals, trumpets, scrolls, marks, crowns. Babylon, the beast, the whore, the lamb. Apocalyptic literature speaks in symbols because direct language becomes dangerous under oppressive systems. And what fascinates me tonight is that both Robert's Rules and Revelation operate through interpretive authority. Who understands the language? Who interprets the procedure? Who defines legitimacy? Who decides what counts as acceptable participation? Because once interpretation becomes centralized, power becomes almost untouchable. A corrupt chairperson can manipulate procedure. A corrupt empire can manipulate doctrine. A corrupt culture can manipulate morality. And everybody watching from the outside thinks, well, it must be official. Official. There's a dangerous word. Official does not always mean righteous. Official sometimes simply means institutionalized. And Revelation repeatedly warns listeners not to confuse worldly authority with divine truth. That warning echoes across centuries. And honestly, it echoes louder now than ever. Between the Beats, with Celine Crow. One of the most haunting images in Revelation is Babylon, not merely as a literal city, but as a symbol, a civilization intoxicated with wealth, power, spectacle, commerce, and self-worship. Babylon appears magnificent, elegant, advanced, connected, influential, but spiritually hollow. And the terrifying part? Most people inside Babylon do not realize they are inside Babylon. Because systems normalize themselves, that is what systems do. Over time, corruption becomes routine. Routine becomes culture. Culture becomes identity. And identity becomes unquestionable. Now think about meetings again. Think about committees. Think about institutions. How many organizations continue functioning long after their original moral purpose disappeared? How many organizations prioritize survival over integrity? How many institutions silence dissent in the name of unity? How many churches protected reputations instead of victims? How many governments defended optics instead of truth? How many corporations buried harm beneath policy language? Procedure can become theater, a performance designed to reassure the public that fairness exists. Meanwhile, the outcomes were predetermined before the meeting even started. That is Babylon. Not merely evil, sophisticated evil, organized evil, professionally managed evil, and Revelation tears away the cosmetic surface of empire to expose what lies underneath. Predation, exploitation, idolatry. spiritual decay. And suddenly the question becomes deeply personal. How many modern systems still function beautifully on the outside while rotting internally? Between the Beats with Celine Crow. There's a kind of peace that comes from procedure, predictability, routine, order. People like systems because systems reduce uncertainty, but revelation presents another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes peace itself becomes deceptive, not genuine peace, managed peace, manufactured peace, a peace built on silence, a peace maintained through fear of disruption. And this is where Robert's rules becomes philosophically fascinating, because the system is built to minimize disorder during deliberation. But what happens when truth itself becomes disruptive? What happens when the morally correct voice is also the inconvenient voice? History shows us countless whistleblowers dismissed as troublemakers. Prophets were disruptive. Reformers were disruptive. Journalists exposing corruption are disruptive. Victims speaking publicly are disruptive. And institutions often respond the same way, out of order. That phrase carries enormous symbolic weight. Out of order. Not necessarily false, not necessarily immoral, not necessarily incorrect, just inconvenient to the structure. And Revelation repeatedly centers voices rejected by dominant systems. Exiles, martyrs, witnesses, the marginalized, those excluded from imperial comfort. Because truth rarely emerges from the center of protected power. Truth usually emerges from the edges, from the wilderness, from prison cells, from lonely islands like Patmos. And perhaps that is one of Revelation's greatest warnings. A civilization can become so obsessed with preserving order that it begins suppressing truth in the name of stability. Between the Beats with Celine Crow. The opening chapters of Revelation address 7 churches. And what's fascinating is that each church represents a different form of spiritual condition: compromise, complacency, fear, corruption, dead ritual, lost passion, institutional arrogance. Now remove the religious labels for a moment. What you're left with is an analysis of organizations. Organizations drifting away from their original purpose. Which means Revelation is not merely mystical, it is diagnostic. It studies decay. And organizational decay often begins subtly. Meetings continue, reports continue, budgets continue, votes continue, procedures continue, everything appears functional. Meanwhile, the soul of the institution disappears? That should frighten every listener tonight, because collapse rarely announces itself dramatically in the beginning. Most collapse begins bureaucratically, quietly, one compromise at a time, one ignored warning at a time, one rationalization at a time, until eventually the institution becomes incapable of self-correction. That is Revelation's deeper horror, not merely destruction from outside, but corruption from within. Between the Beats with Celine Crow. So where does this leave us tonight? Are Robert's rules evil? No. Procedure itself is not evil. Structure is not evil. Organization is not evil. Human communities require systems. The real danger emerges when systems become sacred, when institutions prioritize self-preservation above truth, when procedure becomes more important than people, when technical legitimacy replaces moral legitimacy. And perhaps that is why Revelation continues haunting humanity centuries later, because it asks a question every generation must answer. Who or what actually deserves your allegiance? Empire? Institution? Comfort? Consensus? Authority? Or truth? Even when truth destabilizes the room. Even when truth interrupts the meeting. Even when truth is ruled out of order. And maybe, just maybe, the scariest possibility is this: the apocalypse does not begin with explosions. It begins when humanity becomes incapable of recognizing corruption, because corruption learned how to dress professionally, suit and tie, official seal, formal procedure, approved agenda, recorded minutes, motion carried. Civilization applauds. Meanwhile, the soul quietly leaves the building. Between the Beats with Celine Crow. Tonight was never about predicting the end of the world. It was about recognizing patterns. Because every age believes itself immune to moral collapse. Every empire believes itself permanent. Every institution believes itself justified. And yet history leaves ruins everywhere. Ruins of governments, ruins of churches, ruins of corporations, ruins of civilizations that once believed their systems were eternal. The Book of Revelation survives because it reminds humanity that no structure, no matter how organized, is above judgment. Not kingdoms, not economies, not religious institutions, not media systems, not councils, not committees, not even the procedural machinery people hide behind. So tonight, ask yourself something. When you encounter authority, do you automatically assume legitimacy? Or do you still possess the courage to ask whether the system serves truth or merely protects itself? That question may matter more now than ever before. Between the Beats with Celine Crow. I hope you all enjoyed and picked up something useful in tonight's episode. Until next time. This is Between the Beats with me, Celine Crow, exclusively here on the podcast where truth, rhythm, and rebellion collide, North Strong Unsanctioned. And as I always say, the loudest truths don't live in the noise. They live between the beats. Good night.